Tonight we stand with you on a frost-bitten field, your boots crunching into snow that refuses to melt even under the pale glow of the moon. The air slices your lungs with that crisp Scandinavian bite, so sharp it makes you wonder how anyone decided this was a good place to live year-round. Sheep shuffle around you, their thick wool steaming faintly in the cold, and you realize this is no ordinary flock. Every single one of these woolly creatures has a name, whispered into existence by families who depended on them. And here's your reality check. If you ever had to herd 50 sheep through waist-high snow while wolves eyed you from the tree line, you probably wouldn't survive this. But these Norse families did, and they remembered every single sheep by name. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The snow drifts settle around your ankles, and the first thing you notice is how quiet it feels. Not silent, because there's always the bleating, the crunch of hooves, the faint whistle of a shepherd, but quiet in that way where life feels pared down to its bare essentials: food, warmth, and memory. Here, naming a sheep isn't a quirky hobby, it's survival strategy disguised as folklore. Each creature provides wool to clothe your family, milk for the children, maybe meat when times turn truly desperate. Forgetting who isn't an option. You step closer to a cluster of ewes, and one of them fixes you with a stare so oddly human you half expect her to ask if you've seen her cousin. The farmer beside you murmurs a name, something like Frostbrow, and scratches her ear. The name locks her in place in the farmer's mind, tethering the animal's face, fleece, and habits to memory. And let's be honest, if you had to remember sheep number 47 without a name, you'd lose track faster than you lose your Netflix password. Historically, Norse families depended heavily on sheep for textiles. Wool was their gold, warm, versatile, and tradable. Archaeological finds show spindle whorls, loom weights, and woven fragments across Viking Age sites, proving that the simple sheep underpinned entire economies. Without names, the daily management of flocks, who's pregnant, who wandered, who produces the best fleece, would have been a nightmare. And because writing things down wasn't exactly common practice on a snowy hilltop, spoken memory did all the heavy lifting. The quirky tidbit. Some evidence suggests families named sheep not just for function, but for fun, adding playful, silly names like Crooked Ear or Sleepy Hoof. Imagine shouting that across a snowy ridge while your neighbor pretends not to laugh at you. These names weren't written in stone, they were practical labels sprinkled with humor, designed to be remembered when frost numbed your brain. Historians still argue whether sheep naming in Norse culture was purely functional or had ritual undertones. Was it simply memory management, or did naming create a bond, a kind of respect between human and animal? After all, giving something a name has power. It turns anonymous wool producers into characters in a family saga. And if you've ever given your Roomba a name, you already know how quickly just an object becomes a buddy with quirks. You trudge forward, watching as children chase lambs in the snow. Each child calls out a name they clearly made up 5 minutes ago. But the parents don't scold them, they smile, because those names will stick. A sheep called Snownoze is harder to forget than that lamb from the South Paddock. In a culture where oral storytelling preserved memory, naming animals carried the same rhythm and cadence as reciting a saga. The sheep themselves seem oblivious to this honor, too busy chewing frost-covered grass. But you can sense the weight of tradition hanging in the cold air. Every name spoken aloud becomes a thread, weaving the family, the land, and the flock into a single memory. Miss a thread, and the tapestry unravels. And besides, when winter nights stretch for what feels like half your life, reciting sheep names may have been one of the few games that doubled as survival strategy. Picture yourself standing guard as the night grows darker. You try counting sheep, but not the way modern insomniacs do. You don't say 1, 2, 3. You whisper their names, rolling each onto your tongue like prayer beads. Each name anchors you, reminding you that you know your flock, that they are safe, and that tomorrow there will still be wool for weaving, milk for drinking, and maybe laughter when someone remembers how crooked ear once toppled into a snowdrift. And in this frozen pasture beginning, you realize, naming isn't just for remembering, it's for belonging. Each name holds history, humor, and the promise of survival, spoken aloud in the icy night where forgetting could mean hunger. You shift your weight, your boots pressing deeper into the frosted ground, as the farmer steps forward with a staff tucked under his arm. He gathers the sheep with a low whistle, and suddenly the entire field feels alive with movement. Ewes and rams bump shoulders, lambs dart through legs, and you're left wondering how anyone keeps this chaos straight. Then the farmer does something so ordinary, yet so profound, he begins reciting names aloud, one by one, like a roll call at the edge of the world. His voice is calm but deliberate, each name carrying a small flicker of memory: Snowbrow, Greytuft, Riverfoot, Little Storm. You notice the rhythm, almost like poetry, as if the names were designed to be remembered in sound before they were remembered in thought. It's not just that the farmer knows these sheep, he remembers them by speaking them into existence. Out here, memory isn't kept in a notebook, it's spoken into the cold air, over and over, until it becomes as real as the flock itself. You try it yourself, whispering the names he says, and find the cadence comforting. It reminds you of those childhood moments when you tried to memorize classmates' names, only this time, your survival depends on not mixing up Riverfoot and Snowbrow. Because let's face it, confusing which sheep had the better wool could mean your family ends up scratching through winter in something less warm than a wet sock. Historically, Norse farmers did rely on verbal memory for flock management. Sheep counts weren't always about numbers, they were about individuals. Each ewe might be linked to wool quality, lineage, or temperament. Some sagas even mention flocks as central wealth markers. Land was precious, but wealth could walk on 4 hooves, grazing its way across the hills. By naming, the farmer etched that wealth into memory, ensuring no sheep was just a faceless statistic. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some shepherds reportedly developed almost sing-song methods of recalling sheep, where the names rolled together in a half-chant. It wasn't just practical, it was entertaining. Imagine you, cold to the bone, mumbling Snowbrow, Crooked Ear, Sleepy Hoof like a weird little song to keep yourself awake on a long watch. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf probably thought, "That human has lost it," before slinking away. Historians still argue whether these chants were purely mnemonic or had ritual significance. Were farmers simply creating a handy memory device, or did naming sheep aloud carry a protective charm, a way to bind the animals under human care against wandering predators or worse, forgetfulness? Some scholars lean toward practicality, others toward the magical worldview of the Norse. After all, in a culture where words and names held immense power, think spells, runes, and oaths, why wouldn't speaking a sheep's name aloud carry more than just memory? The farmer waves you closer, encouraging you to try again. You stumble over Riverfoot, mixing it with Stormere, and he chuckles. He explains that each name isn't random, it links to a story. Riverfoot once waded into the stream too deep. Stormere was born in thunder. The names are little memory hooks, so tied to story you couldn't forget them if you tried. It dawns on you, this is less about rote memorization and more about weaving identity through anecdote. Forget the name, and you forget the story, and without the story, the flock becomes anonymous. Children dart past, giggling as they imitate the farmer. Their voices are high-pitched, but they mimic the rhythm perfectly. For them, this game is rehearsal, a way to learn the flock while also playing at being shepherds. You catch yourself smiling, because it feels like a bedtime game, a list of names spoken until you drift into drowsy security. The Norse weren't counting sheep to fall asleep, they were counting their sheep to stay awake, alert, and connected. The roll call stretches on, and you feel the hypnotic tug of repetition. One name after another, each distinct but flowing into the next, like beads on a string. You realize how fragile memory can be, how one slip could unravel the chain. And yet, the farmer never falters, his voice steady against the winter air. This, you think, is more than a chore. It's art. It's the art of keeping memory alive without ink or paper. And here's the final twist: you notice that when the farmer finishes, he doesn't count heads. He trusts the names. By speaking them aloud, he believes he has called each into being. Each one accounted for, each one alive in the rhythm of his words. You might scoff at the idea, but when you hear that last name roll off his tongue, you feel it too. A strange reassurance that nothing has been forgotten, that all is safe. So you stand there, your breath clouding in the air, repeating the names under your own breath until they almost sound like lullabies. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you realize you'll remember Crooked Ear long after tonight, because spoken memory has a way of lodging itself deeper than you'd expect. The farmer leaves you standing in the snow for a moment, his voice still echoing in your ears with that rhythmic list of names. You rub your hands together, trying to coax warmth back into your fingers, and then you notice something. As the sheep graze, their names aren't just random labels. They're rooted in the landscape itself. You crouch down, tracing the edge of a rock slick with frost, and realize that the boulder here looks suspiciously like a lumpy sheep. The farmer catches your gaze, grins, and tells you, "That one there is rock back." Suddenly, the naming scheme makes sense. The land becomes the notepad, the sheep the ink, and the names the story tying them together. You wander a little further, careful not to slip on frozen grass, and see another ewe. Her name? River Snout. Why? Because she once stuck her nose into a stream and nearly froze it off. It's practical, it's funny, and it's impossible to forget once you've seen her long wet face. You glance at the winding river nearby, frozen in patches but still glimmering in moonlight, and it's clear, naming sheep after land features works like a memory map. Each name tethers the animal to the environment, and the environment tethers the memory to the family. Historically, Norse culture was deeply tied to the land, almost obsessively so. Place names still scatter across Scandinavia, many describing features like fjord, hill, marsh, or stone. When families extended that practice to sheep, they were essentially creating portable place names, living creatures carrying bits of the landscape on their backs. The flock itself became a walking geography lesson. Forget one, and you didn't just lose track of a sheep, you lost part of the mental map of home. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some Icelandic sagas hint that animals weren't just named after landscapes, they could also influence place names. Imagine a particularly bold ram named Cliffhoof leaping off a ridge so often that locals eventually called the spot Cliffhoof's Jump. That's one way to ensure a sheep achieves immortality without ever becoming a hero in a saga. Historians still argue whether naming sheep after landforms was purely practical or had spiritual undertones. Was it a way to create easy recall markers, or was there a belief that by linking sheep to the land, you anchored them spiritually, ensuring they stayed tied to the farm? Some scholars lean toward practicality. You'd want to remember which sheep produced the best fleece. Others argue the Norse worldview blurred the line between people, animals, and landscape. A sheep wasn't just grazing on a hill, it became part of the hill, part of the story, and naming reflected that fusion. The farmer waves you closer to a rise overlooking the valley. He points to a sheep called Fjordtail, whose fleece sways like water when she runs. Then he points to Meadowbelly, a plump ewe who always waddles to the same grassy patch. You can't help but chuckle. It's not far off from the way you might nickname co-workers after their quirks. Printer Jammer. Anyone? The sheep graze without complaint, unaware that they are walking memory anchors, carrying whole landscapes in their names. You feel the connection yourself as you look out at the horizon. Every rise, every stone, every stream suddenly seems alive, because it has a counterpart in the flock. If you lost the flock, you'd lose those stories. And in winter, when snow swallows every landmark, the sheep themselves become living signposts of the land hidden beneath the ice. Children run by again, laughing as they point to a sheep and yell, "Puddle face." The farmer sighs, but you notice he doesn't correct them. Because by spring, when the snow melts, there will be puddles again, and that name will carry the season's memory forward. For the Norse, names weren't carved in stone, they adapted, shifted, sometimes even stretched into new jokes or new reminders. The land changed, the sheep aged, and names bent with the flow. You try whispering a few of the names: rockback, riversnout, fjordtail, meadowbelly. The rhythm has a strange effect on you. It feels less like recitation and more like weaving threads into a net, each name a knot binding animal to place, place to story, story to family. And as you repeat them, you realize you'll remember those sheep long after the cold night passes. One ewe with a striking grey coat passes close by, her wool catching a faint silver from the moon. The farmer tells you her name is Moonfleece. You laugh, because of course someone in the family got poetic. And yet, standing there, you can't deny the name fits. She's not just a sheep, she's a piece of the sky stitched onto the earth. And so the landscape lives in the flock, and the flock lives in the names. You understand now, in a place where memory means survival, naming sheep after rivers, rocks, and fjords wasn't just clever. It was a way of turning the frozen world into something unforgettable, one woolly echo of the land at a time. Your breath fogs the air as you lean on a fence post, watching the farmer move among the flock again. This time, the names he calls out have a different texture. They don't sound like rivers or rocks. They sound like weather, like storms captured in wool. One sheep ambles by with fleece thick as a winter coat in a department store clearance aisle, and the farmer scratches her chin, calling her snowback. Another, thin and wiry, earns the name Windrib, because the poor thing always looks as though a strong gust might blow her halfway to Denmark. You realize the Norse weren't just attaching names to the land. They were mapping the sky, the seasons, and the wool itself into the flock. When you live in a place where weather determines whether you eat or freeze, it makes sense that sheep would bear names echoing snow, rain, thunder, or sun. Each one is like a diary entry in fleece form. Historically, weather dominated daily life in Scandinavia. Without modern forecasts, families relied on reading the sky, listening to winds, and learning patterns through painful trial and error. Sheep were central to this cycle, shearing, lambing, and grazing all shifted with the turning of seasons. Names like Stormere or Frosttail weren't whimsical, they were mnemonic bookmarks reminding families of when the sheep was born, what the skies looked like, or how harsh a particular season felt. Think of it like tagging old photos, except instead of summer 2018, you had Snowback, born during the storm that took half the roof. Here's the quirky tidbit. There are whispers in some folk traditions that particularly wild storms were blamed on animals themselves. If a ram was especially unruly, he might be nicknamed Thunderhoof, not just because of his stomping but because people half-joked he brought bad weather with him. Was it superstition? Probably. But when you're snowed in for 3 months straight, blaming your livestock for cosmic chaos isn't the strangest coping mechanism. Historians still argue whether naming sheep after weather events reflected observation alone or carried ritual undertones. Some say it was strictly memory, an easy shorthand. Others believe the act bordered on magical thinking, as if a sheep carrying the name Sunbelly might protect against another endless winter. The Norse worldview rarely drew clear lines between practical and mystical. What you called something mattered, because names were power. So perhaps Stormere wasn't just descriptive, it was a subtle hedge against the storm itself. The farmer waves a hand, drawing your attention to a lamb with wool almost unnaturally thick for its size. He laughs and calls her Blanket. His daughter insists her name is Cloud. You can see the debate already woven into the family's rhythm. Which name will stick? Probably both, depending on who's calling. Either way, the wool tells its own story. This is the lamb born in a particularly brutal winter, one whose fleece grew dense out of necessity. Naming becomes shorthand not just for recognition but for survival strategy. Which sheep will keep you warmest come January? You walk among the animals, running your hand over their coats. Some are coarse, some soft, some patchy from rough grazing. Each one seems to wear its story in its wool. Frostbrow has ice still clinging near her eyes. Rainhoof stomps through puddles with glee. You can't help but think, if you ever tried remembering dozens of sheep without names tied to weather, your brain would melt faster than snow on a blacksmith's forge. Children scamper through the field again, pointing out Drizzleear and Sunpatch. They giggle because the names are funny, but you sense something deeper. They're learning to track time itself. By tying sheep to weather, they're anchoring memory to the cycles of nature. Someday, those same kids will recall, yes, Sunpatch was born in the year the sun returned early. It's oral history disguised as bedtime naming. And of course, there's humor. You overhear a boy call out Mudpants as one you struggles through slush. The adults roll their eyes, but you know in your heart that name is sticking. Every flock has at least one Mudpants. Names like these soften the edge of hardship. When your world is ruled by snow and storm, laughter is as vital as warmth. The farmer, serious again, runs his hand over a ram's horn and tells you the names help him remember who thrives and who struggles. Stormir. He's tough. Survived the worst winter I've seen. Windrib. Weak lungs. Might not last another year. The names are more than labels, they're evaluations. They record not just identity but performance. Forgetting them would mean forgetting vital information about the flock's health and future. You lean back, watching the sky cloud over, and it hits you. Out here, where the weather never leaves you alone, naming sheep after snow, wind, or sun isn't just clever. It's a way of speaking to the sky itself, of making peace with forces too big to control. And maybe, just maybe, when the storm howls across the valley, calling out Stormir into the night feels like an act of solidarity, a reminder that even the fiercest weather can be survived, as long as you remember it by name. The wind whips across the pasture, tossing your hair into your face as you follow the farmer toward a small shed where children huddle, giggling. You expect them to be working, tying bundles of wool, maybe practicing some solemn tradition. Instead, you hear them laughing at the top of their lungs, calling out names that sound suspiciously like inside jokes. A plump sheep waddles by, and one boy yells, "That's Uncle Belly." Another points at a skittish ewe and shouts, "Aunt Screech." Everyone bursts into laughter, including the farmer himself, though he tries to scold them through his smile. It dawns on you that sheep weren't always given names that were poetic or weather-bound. Sometimes, they became walking jokes, furry canvases for family humor. When life is a brutal cycle of cold, hunger, and endless chores, a sheep named after your cousin's bad singing voice is comedy gold. You lean on the fence as one child proudly introduces you to Big Nose, a ram who does, in fact, have a colossal snout. Another points at a ewe with crooked legs, "Wobbly Auntie." The sheep blink indifferently, utterly unaware they are carrying the honor and embarrassment of human relatives into the pasture. You chuckle, because if your family had to survive long winters with nothing but firelight and chores for entertainment, you'd probably start naming livestock after each other too. Historically, humor and nicknaming were common in Norse society. Sagas are full of characters with playful or mocking names: Flatnose, Hairy Breeches, Skullsplitter. These weren't just descriptive, they often carried a teasing undertone, the kind of nickname that stuck whether the person liked it or not. Extending that practice to sheep makes perfect sense. If you could call your neighbor Goosebeard, why not call a sheep Lazy Tail after your brother who never finished his chores? Here's the quirky tidbit. Some families reportedly used sheep names to settle or stoke petty rivalries. Imagine your neighbor boasts about his fine ram, and you casually mention yours is named Better Horns. That's one way to make the next market day interesting. Sheep, in this way, became pawns in an ongoing comedy show, where every name was a sly wink across the fence. Historians still argue whether these humorous names were purely entertainment or if they had practical mnemonic value. Were they just jokes, or did they help families remember specific quirks in the flock? After all, calling a sheep Uncle Belly might help you instantly recall which one is too fat to chase uphill. Some scholars lean toward practicality, while others emphasize that humor itself was survival. In a world ruled by hardship, laughter carved out a little space for joy. You watch the farmer's wife step out of the shed, shaking her head at the children's antics, but then she scratches Uncle Belly behind the ears with surprising tenderness. Clearly, the joke doesn't diminish the bond, it strengthens it. When the sheep is called by name, the family laughs together, and that laughter becomes memory. You can imagine the story passed down. Remember old Uncle Belly, the ram who ate the winter rations and still looked hungry? The sheep becomes part of family lore, more than just livestock. You wander into the shed, where the walls are plastered with drying herbs, tools, and bundles of wool. A girl points at a sheep chewing on rope and declares, "Rope thief." Her brother adds, "That's Dad when he borrows tools." The family roars with laughter, and you realize the naming is a game of comparison. Sheep become mirrors of the household, reflecting quirks and flaws in woolly form. It's like a medieval version of giving your Wi-Fi funny names, except these names wander the pasture. One boy tugs your sleeve and points to a particularly stubborn ewe who refuses to budge. "That's Grandma," he says, giggling uncontrollably. The farmer tries not to laugh but can't resist, muttering, "She does have the same stare." The ewe blinks at you, unimpressed, and continues chewing grass like she owns the place. You bite back your own laugh, because honestly, she does look like someone's grandma in sheep form. You notice something else here. The jokes aren't cruel. They're affectionate, a way of turning hardship into play. Naming sheep after family quirks makes the animals less anonymous and more like members of the household. In winter, when the line between human and animal survival blurs, perhaps that shared identity felt comforting. And the best part? These names stick. No one forgets Uncle Belly or Rope Thief. In fact, they become part of the rhythm of family storytelling, passed down like legends. One day, long after the sheep are gone, children will still laugh at the memory of Grandma the ewe, stubborn as stone. So you stand there in the warm shed, surrounded by laughter, and realize that sometimes memory isn't serious business at all. Sometimes, it's a shared joke, a giggle in the dark, a sheep named after Uncle Belly carrying the weight of humor through the hardest winter nights. The laughter from the shed lingers in your ears as you step back into the cold, the flock milling lazily in the fading light. You expect the farmer to carry on with more jokes, more Uncle Belly moments, but instead his voice softens, almost reverent. He points toward a ram with thick curling horns, his wool dark as storm clouds, and says, "That one is Thorhoof." You blink, wait, they're naming sheep after gods now? Yes. Here, sheep don't just carry family humor. Some bear the weight of entire myths. You look around and start noticing it, a ewe called Freyjafleece, lambs nicknamed Odin's twins, and even one particularly stubborn ram introduced as Loki's trouble. The family chuckles at that last one, but the undertone is serious. Naming sheep after gods or giants isn't just whimsy, it's stitching mythology into daily life. Historically, Norse mythology seeped into every corner of culture. Gods weren't distant, they were woven into weather, harvests, and daily survival. Invoking their names could be both respectful and protective. If a ram was called Thorhoof, perhaps it was hoped he'd embody the god's strength. A ewe named after Freyja might symbolize fertility and abundance. Myths weren't separate stories told around the fire, they were lenses for understanding the world, including the woolly four-legged part of it. Here's your quirky tidbit. There are folk tales hinting that some families avoided naming sheep after certain gods out of fear of attracting bad luck. Loki names, for example, could be a gamble. Sure, it's funny to call a mischievous ram Loki, but what if that really did invite chaos into the flock? If you've ever owned a pet that lived up to its chaotic nickname, yes, I'm looking at you, Bitey, you understand the risk. Historians still argue whether mythological sheep names were genuine acts of reverence or just storytelling flair. Were families invoking divine protection, or were they just spinning myths into daily jokes? Some sagas hint at ritual use of animal names tied to gods, while other sources make it sound casual, almost playful. The truth, as always, probably sat somewhere in between. For a family huddled through long winters, the line between sacred and silly blurred more easily than you'd think. You move closer to Thorhoof, who stomps the ground with such force you half expect lightning to strike. The farmer nods proudly, strongest in the flock. He carries the god's name well. Then he gestures toward Loki's trouble, who is, unsurprisingly, chewing on the corner of the fence. Everyone groans. You can't help but laugh. Clearly, Loki's reputation has followed this sheep into reality. Children gather around and start chanting little stories they've made up. How Freyjafleece will bring beautiful cloth to the village, how Odin's twins will guide travelers across snow. Their imagination blurs seamlessly into myth. To them, these sheep aren't just animals, they're living symbols, furry echoes of the sagas they've overheard by the hearth. You realize this is how mythology stays alive, not only in carved runestones or epic poems but also in the daily naming of sheep. You picture the family during a feast, telling stories of Thorhoof battling the wolves or Loki's trouble escaping the pen again. These tales, half serious and half silly, stitch the farm into the broader cosmos of Norse belief. Even if no one writes the story down, the sheep carry it forward until their names are retold in laughter or memory long after they're gone. And here's a little modern joke for you. Imagine trying to sell wool at a market. The buyer asks, "Which sheep is this from?" And you casually answer, "Odin's beard." Talk about branding. Nike and Apple could never. But beneath the humor, you feel something sacred in the naming. By attaching myth to animals, families embedded themselves in a larger story, one where gods and humans, storms and sheep, all shared the same fragile world. The flock wasn't just wealth, it was a small pantheon grazing in the snow. As you stand there, the twilight deepening, Thorhoof lifts his head, steam curling from his breath. The sound of his hooves striking the ground carries across the field, echoing faintly like a distant drum. For a fleeting moment, you believe the farmer's words, that in naming, the gods are present here, stitched into wool, walking among mortals in the quiet of the pasture. The twilight folds into a softer blue, and the air feels hushed, as if the entire valley is holding its breath. You expect the farmer to call out more names, but instead he does something unexpected. He hums. The sound is low, steady, and almost hypnotic, and then you realize he's singing the sheep names. One by one, they slip into melody. Thorhoof, Freyjafleece, Stormir, Uncle Belly. The flock doesn't react, but you do. The rhythm pulls at you like a lullaby, weaving memory into music. You follow the farmer toward the farmhouse, where the family gathers near the doorway. The children pick up the tune, their voices lighter, lilting the names into a chorus. It's not opera, it's more like a chant, half song, half list. And suddenly, you understand, this is how they remember. Not just with repetition, not just with jokes, but by turning the entire roll call into song. Historically, this makes perfect sense. The Norse had a rich oral tradition, and memory often lived in rhythm. Skalds, the poets, composed long sagas and verses designed to be recited, often with rhyme or meter to anchor them in the mind. If you can remember hundreds of lines about kings and gods, You can certainly remember a flock of sheep by singing their names. The melody acts like glue, holding each name in place. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some folklore, families reportedly sang their flock's names not just during chores but also at bedtime, as a kind of lullaby. Picture it: children drifting off while hearing Snowbrow, Riversnout, Thorhoof, Fragerfleece. Forget sheep numbers, these kids literally counted sheep names to fall asleep. Which means the world's most famous sleep aid might actually trace back to Norse pastures. Historians still argue whether these songs were purely mnemonic or whether they carried ritual weight. Was it just about remembering sheep, or did the act of singing protect the flock, ward off misfortune, or invite blessings from the gods? Some scholars lean toward the practical song is memory aid. Others argue that in Norse culture, where sound and spoken word held power, singing names was closer to incantation than lullaby. And honestly, listening to the farmer's voice drifting across the snowy field, you feel both explanations tugging at you. The farmer's wife joins in, her voice richer, wrapping around the children's lighter tones. The melody thickens, becomes fuller. You hear the names carried not just as labels, but as verses, each sheep embedded into a family symphony. You catch yourself humming along, stumbling over the names but finding comfort in the cadence. It's ridiculously soothing. If you weren't standing in freezing air, you'd be tempted to curl up right there in the snow. The children, of course, turn it into a game. They stretch names, exaggerate syllables, or toss in silly rhythms. Uncle Bellywywy. Everyone laughs, the seriousness broken, but the memory reinforced. Every time the name is sung, it sticks deeper. The sheep become a choir of stories, each one carried on melody. You wander closer to the flock, humming under your breath, and something remarkable happens. The sheep, normally indifferent to human noise, seem calmer. They cluster loosely, chewing slowly, eyes half-lidded. Is it coincidence, or do they actually like the sound? The farmer shrugs when you ask, but his smile suggests he believes the song soothes them too. Perhaps the flock is as tied to the melody as the family is. Picture the long winters, nights stretching for what feels like forever. Families huddled by the fire, the howling wind outside, and children restless in bed. Instead of reciting prayers or dry lists, parents sing the sheep names. Each name recalls an animal, a story, a moment. It's both lullaby and roll call, comfort and memory. The sheep exist in two worlds at once, alive outside in the snow and alive inside the melody of bedtime song. And of course, there's humor woven in. The youngest child belts out mud pants so loudly that everyone groans, and you nearly choke from laughing. Yet the name stays, sticky as honey, impossible to forget. You can imagine that years from now, someone will hum that name and smile at the memory of tonight's laughter. As the song drifts on, the firelight spilling from the farmhouse flickers against the frost. You feel yourself softening into the rhythm, the names blending into lullaby. For a fleeting moment, the world outside, the cold, the danger, the wolves in the distance, disappears. All that matters are these voices, this flock, these names wrapped in melody. And you think, memory has never sounded so much like music. The song lingers in your ears even as the family drifts into other chores, but you notice someone new taking the lead. A child, maybe 8 or 9, steps forward with all the seriousness of a seasoned farmer. She adjusts the woolen shawl slipping from her shoulders, clears her throat dramatically, and announces that it is her turn to do the naming. The adults chuckle, but they don't stop her. Instead, they let her march right up to the flock with all the authority of a tiny queen. You follow her closely, curious. She points at a shaggy ewe chewing frost-covered grass. "This one is Snownoze," she declares, and just like that, the name sticks. Another sheep earns Crooked Ear, while a lamb is proudly christened Little Trouble. The family claps, though the mother mutters that the lamb definitely didn't need more encouragement to be trouble. Still, No one interrupts. You realize you're watching an apprenticeship of sorts, children learning the tradition by actually doing it. Historically, it tracks. In Norse households, children were expected to contribute early. They weren't just miniature adults for the aesthetic, they had chores, responsibilities, and often roles that shaped them for adult life. Giving a child the job of naming sheep wasn't just a game, it was memory practice, storytelling training, and even an early lesson in authority. Imagine being 6 years old and getting to pick names that adults then had to remember for months. That's power. Here's the quirky bit. Some sagas mention children practicing kennings, those poetic metaphors the Norse loved, by applying them to everyday things. If a sheep could be called Cloudfoot or Meadow Drinker, you can bet that a child somewhere coined it first. Historians still argue whether these early naming games shaped the more sophisticated poetry traditions, or whether the influence ran the other way. Did kids parody the adults' verse styles, or did the adults borrow the kids' wild inventiveness? Either way, the evidence suggests children were allowed to play with words until they found patterns that stuck. The little girl in front of you certainly seems to think she's a poet. She squints at one particularly stubborn ram and names him Boulder Brain. Everyone bursts out laughing, and the sheep flicks an ear in annoyance, as if aware it has just been roasted by a child. You find yourself laughing too, and realize that jokes like this would have cemented memories. You're far less likely to forget Boulder Brain than you are ram number 4. As the child continues her ceremony of naming, you see how this process shapes identity, not just the sheep's, but hers too. She takes responsibility, she learns to observe details, snow on the nose, a bent ear, the sheep's attitude, and she gains confidence when the adults accept her choices. For a moment, she is the Skald of the pasture, author of her own tiny saga. Later, when the family gathers inside, the children take turns retelling the sheep names they gave earlier in the day. It becomes a sort of fireside story. You watch as the youngest boy insists that his lamb Tiny Horns once scared off a crow, and though the story is clearly made up, everyone nods sagely as if the sheep might indeed be a feathered foe slayer. The act of naming merges seamlessly with the act of storytelling, and soon every sheep has not only a name but also a legend attached to it. This is memory reinforced in layers: sight, sound, repetition, and narrative. And it's sneaky. The kids think they're just telling silly stories, but they're actually cementing the mental map of the flock. By bedtime, they'll know every sheep by name, detail, and invented saga. When you think about it, this might be one of history's earliest forms of gamified learning, long before apps and pop quizzes, just children naming sheep under the northern lights. You smile, realizing that even the tiniest mischief gets remembered this way. The little boy names a sheep Poop Bottom, and though the father groans and insists they'll change that one later, you can already tell the name will stick for generations. Imagine being a descendant centuries later, puzzling over a record that lists Poop Bottom alongside more noble names like Snownose and Cloudfoot. Scholars today would be baffled, but you've just seen it happen. Children leave their marks, however ridiculous. It makes you think about how memory isn't sterile. It's messy, playful, sometimes embarrassing. Just like the flock, it needs to be herded, but it also leaps the fence occasionally and wanders off into humor. That's what keeps it alive. As you tuck into a wooden bench by the fire, the family still laughing over the day's new names, you realize the child's duty goes deeper than practice. By naming sheep, she ties herself to the flock, the land, the rhythm of family survival. If she remembers the names, she remembers the stories. If she remembers the stories, she remembers who she is. And if you're being honest, that's not so different from you right now, sitting in the warmth, memory humming in your own chest, each sheep name sticking just a little deeper into your tired mind. The fire dims to embers, and outside the farmhouse window the moon glints on snow like polished bone. You think the naming ceremony is over, but no, there's another twist. At dawn, the farmer rises, stretches his stiff shoulders, and steps outside. His breath makes little clouds in the cold air as he surveys the flock again. You hear him murmur a few names under his breath, yet they don't sound quite the same as last night. He pauses at the lamb called Tiny Horns and nods. Not so tiny anymore. You'll be half-ram this season. The lamb bleats as though in approval. Another ewe, once called Snownoze, now has frost caked along her woolly backside. The farmer smirks. Snowbutt. You try not to laugh too loudly, but honestly, it's a worthy rebrand. This is how you discover another layer of the tradition, renaming. Every season shifts the flock, and with it, their identities. The Norse lived by cycles of sowing and harvest, of lambing and slaughter, of winter darkness and summer light. So, of course, the names of the sheep bent and flexed to match those rhythms. It wasn't static memory, it was memory alive, seasonal, in motion. Historically, farmers in Scandinavia measured time through festivals and markers like Yule, Midsummer, and harvest. Sheep tied into those cycles too, since lambs were often born in spring, wool sheared in summer, and meat salted before winter. Naming sheep wasn't just a label, it was a record of where the animal stood in the wheel of the year. You see the pattern unfold before your eyes. A lamb starts as Tiny Horns, grows into half-ram, and someday, though no one says it aloud, will earn a final name, perhaps Stewpot. Grim? Yes. Practical? Absolutely. Here's a quirky tidbit you didn't expect. In some rural traditions, families held small gatherings to officially rename sheep at seasonal changes, almost like a birthday party but with less cake and more smoke from the hearth. A sheep renamed at midsummer might carry songs of fertility, while one renamed at Yule might take on wintry epithets like frostmuzzle or snowshadow. It turns the flock into a living calendar, each woolly creature a reminder of time passing. Historians still argue whether these renamings were strictly pragmatic or if they leaned into ritual. Was it just practical updates like relabeling a file, or was there some magic in speaking a fresh name aloud as the seasons turned? Some say it echoed the Norse idea that names themselves had power, the same belief that gave rise to rune carving and epic sagas. Others shrug and suggest it was just easier to keep track when the names matched the season. Either way, the sheep seem unbothered. You, however, are oddly enchanted. The children take to the renaming with gusto. They run through the flock pointing and shouting new titles like little town criers. Crooked Ear is now Straight Ear, because it's better. Uncle Belly is Big Uncle Belly. Their laughter echoes against the frosted barn. Some names get longer, more ridiculous. Soon one unlucky ram is called Mighty Hornhaver the Magnificent of Mud. You pity him, though you admit you'll never forget his name. You notice something else. Renaming also serves as an emotional cushion. When an old sheep dies in winter, its name doesn't vanish immediately, it gets reborn on a lamb come spring. Snowbutt too trots through the meadow, blissfully unaware of the legacy she carries. In this way, names outlast the flesh, making memory feel continuous. The family doesn't mourn so much as recycle, smoothing the hard edges of loss into tradition. Standing in the biting cold, you almost hear time itself moving with each name spoken. A sheep renamed is a season marked, a cycle closed, another opened. Memory becomes not just about keeping track, but about acknowledging the rhythm of life. You find yourself whispering along, half-ram, snowbutt, mighty hornhaver. The words feel like beads on a string, each one clicked into place as the wheel of the year turns. And maybe that's why you can't shake the thought. You don't just remember the flock by naming it, you remember yourself. The changing names remind you that you, too, shift with the seasons. Someday you'll be renamed, in ways big or small. You hope your future names are kinder than Snowbutt. The sun doesn't so much rise as creep, stretching pale light across the snow. The flock moves slowly, their breath pluming into the air, and you notice something you hadn't seen before. There's an emptiness in the pasture. A space between two sheep where one used to stand. The farmer's eyes keep drifting there too, and though he doesn't say it, you realize a sheep is missing. It hits harder than you expect. The family has so many sheep, you'd think one vanishing wouldn't matter much. But here's the secret. When you name them, each one stops being just livestock and becomes part of the family. Losing one feels like losing a cousin, a neighbor, someone who shared your meals and your chores. The silence in that gap is louder than the bleating all around it. The farmer kneels down, brushing snow from the trampled grass, as if searching for a clue. He mutters the name softly under his breath. Frosteer. You don't know where Frosteer has gone, maybe taken by wolves, maybe lost in a storm, but the name still lingers, spoken like a ghost. The sheep is gone, yet the name refuses to disappear. Historically, Norse farmers lost plenty of sheep. Harsh winters, predators, accidents, it was inevitable. And yet, instead of erasing the missing animal, they kept the names alive. Sometimes they reassigned them to new lambs, sometimes they wove them into stories. You imagine children whispering about Frosteer long after the ewe vanished, building her into legend. Maybe she was carried away by Odin's ravens. Maybe she wandered into the land of giants. A lost sheep's name often outlived the sheep itself. Here's the quirky tidbit. In certain folktales, families spoke of ghost sheep that returned at night, their names echoing in the wind. Farmers supposedly heard familiar bleats on the edges of their fields, and some claimed it was bad luck to rename too quickly, as if the spirit of the sheep might feel slighted. Whether or not you believe in ghostly bleating, the habit of holding on to names seems rooted in both grief and superstition. Historians still argue whether these lingering names were simply practical markers, we used to have Frosteer, or whether they carried genuine memorial weight, closer to how we today keep photo albums or grave markers. Was it memory for farming, or memory for mourning? Either way, when you hear the farmer whisper Frosteer, it feels like both. The children, of course, wrestle with loss in their own way. One of them insists Frosteer has simply gone off on an adventure, probably to find warmer grass in Ireland. Another declares that Frosteer was obviously taken into Valhalla, because she was the bravest sheep in the flock. The youngest starts to cry quietly, but the older ones rally, singing the sheep's name in the old melody until the tears turn into laughter. You watch it unfold, grief softened by song, by story, by keeping the name alive. And then something remarkable happens. The farmer marks a stick of firewood with runes, simple scratches, not elaborate artistry, and sets it aside. It's a memorial of sorts, tucked near the hearth. You can tell it won't last forever. Firewood gets burned eventually. But until then, Frosteer exists not just in memory but carved in wood. You feel a pang in your chest, realizing that even fleeting markers matter when paired with a name. As the night stretches again, the family still whispers Frosteer's name now and then. It slips into conversation, into jokes, into song. The sheep is absent, yet also present, haunting the edges of memory. You realize this is how people survive loss, not by forgetting, but by carrying the names forward, even when the bodies can't follow. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the snow crack under hoof and boot. And you swear you hear it, a faint bleat, carried by the wind, far off in the distance. Maybe it's imagination, maybe it's just another sheep. But part of you wonders if Frosteer really has wandered beyond, lingering as long as her name is spoken. The wind sharpens over the fjord, and the farmer's family bundles up, preparing for a journey. You trail behind them as they coax a few sheep onto a sled lined with hay. Not all sheep travel, only a chosen handful, the ones with the best wool or sturdy build. Each one is tied with a rope harness, and their names are spoken softly as though to steady them. Stormir, keep calm. Halfram, don't you start trouble. The names cling to the air like charms, half practical, half protective. The road is long, crunching beneath the sled runners, and you realize you're watching the moment when names leave home. It's one thing to keep track of your flock in your own fields, but another entirely to carry those names into markets, ports, and villages. As the family passes other farms, voices call out greetings and laughter. "How's Uncle Belly holding up this winter?" someone teases. The sheep's fame, it seems, travels faster than the sled. Historically, Norse farmers didn't just stay put, they traded. Sheep meant wool, milk, meat, and sometimes currency itself. At markets, animals were bartered and sold, often described not just by weight or fleece but by name. Imagine the confusion if you sold Snownos to your neighbor, and months later, you both had to clarify whether you meant the sheep Snownos or the new Snownos in your own flock. Yet names added personality to commerce, and in some cases, helped keep trust alive. After all, if you promised to sell a sheep named Goodwill, everyone knew exactly which sheep that was supposed to be. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some sagas hint that sheep names traveled across seas. Norse traders carried not only goods but stories, and sometimes these stories included animals by name. One merchant might brag in Ireland about a ewe called Frejafleece back home, exaggerating her wool yield the way a fisherman boasts of his biggest catch. It sounds absurd, but in a world where reputation mattered, a sheep's name could become part of your identity abroad. Historians still argue whether these traveling names were remembered outside their home farms or whether they dissolved quickly once trade was done. Did a sheep renamed by its new owner keep echoes of its past identity, or was it reborn completely? Some scholars suggest that names might have acted like passports, carrying lineage across borders. Others scoff, saying names were too local to matter once an animal crossed the fjord. Watching Stormir stumble slightly on the icy path, you wonder if names might cling longer than anyone expects. At the market square, the air is thick with smells: smoked fish, tar, wool, and human sweat. The family pulls their sheep into the noisy throng, and the shouting begins. Bargains rise and fall, and sheep are inspected like treasure. Yet amid the chaos, you notice the farmer calling each animal by name, as if refusing to let them drown in anonymity. Careful with Boulder Brain, he kicks, he warns one man. Snowbutt's fleece is thicker than she looks, he adds with a grin. The names cut through the din, turning trade into story. Children race around the edges of the market, singing silly versions of the sheep naming song. You catch snippets: Poop Bottom the Brave, and shake your head. Even here, the oral tradition spills out into laughter, echoing over barrels and stalls. It makes you realize how much these names connect people. Even strangers lean in, chuckling, recognizing the humor, maybe even remembering the names long after they've gone home. The family doesn't sell all the sheep. Some are too precious to part with, some too stubborn to fetch a good price. But those that are sold leave in pairs or trios, their names carried in the farmer's voice until the ropes change hands. You feel a pang watching them walk away, their bleats fading into the crowd. Will they keep their names in their new homes, or will they be renamed to fit another family's humor and memory? On the way back, the sled is lighter, the farmer's pouch heavier with silver and grain. Yet the family still murmurs the names of the ones left behind, as if refusing to let them vanish entirely. Stormir, Halfram, Snowbutt all return to the field. But somewhere in the next valley, a sheep once called Frejafleece now belongs to another story, another memory, another naming. And you can't help but think, when names travel, they don't just mark sheep, they mark connections. They tie farms together, stretch stories across borders, and turn commerce into something strangely human. Even a simple bleat can carry the echo of home when you know which name to attach to it. You're barely back from the market before the gossip starts. The farmer sits by the fire, warming his hands, and the neighbors drift in for a mug of ale and a good laugh. Of course, they talk about sheep, not just who sold what, but whose flock is thriving, whose wool is thin, and whose animals are apparently dumber than a sack of rocks. The names spill into the chatter like sparks, each one an inside joke waiting to be fanned. You realize quickly that sheep names aren't just memory tools, they're weapons. So, you're still keeping Mudpants alive, a neighbor teases with a smirk. The children burst into giggles, while the farmer grumbles but secretly smiles. Another neighbor announces with great pride that he has a ram called King of Horns. Immediately, the farmer counters with, "Ah, yes, I met him, he was running from my store the other day." The room erupts. Rivalry, it seems, is best served with wool. Historically, Scandinavian communities thrived on playful competition. Feasts, markets, and even legal gatherings often carried a streak of humor, sometimes biting, sometimes light. Naming sheep became another way to poke fun across fences. A ewe named Laserlegs might be a jab at a neighbor's famously sluggish animals. A ram called Crooked Tooth could be less about his bite and more about the farmer down the road with the same flaw. The sheep became living caricatures, woolly stand-ins for the humans nearby. Here's the quirky tidbit. In one folktale, a farmer supposedly named an entire subgroup of his flock after a rival's family, each sheep carrying a mocking twist. Ole's big nose, Ole's bad back, and Ole's wife's gossip. It must have been scandalous, but it also guaranteed that no one in the village would forget those sheep or that feud for years. Imagine hearing your flaws bleated back at you every morning. Historians still argue whether this kind of naming was widespread tradition or just isolated mischief. Was it a cultural norm to turn flocks into parody theaters, or were these just a few mischievous farmers who couldn't resist stirring the pot? Evidence is scarce, but oral history and regional jokes hint that teasing through sheep names may have been more common than polite records let on. After all, official sagas tend to skip over Poop Bottom 2 and Ole's big nose. Back in the farmhouse, you watch the playful banter roll on. The farmer's children lean close, whispering schemes for the next round of naming. "Let's call the new lamb neighbor Stinky Feet," one suggests, eyes sparkling with wicked glee. Their mother sighs, but you notice she doesn't forbid it. Because deep down, even insults become stories, and stories are memory. The sheep themselves shuffle outside, blissfully unaware that their names are being turned into jokes at the hearth. You can't help but laugh at the absurdity, entire rivalries distilled into woolly nicknames. Yet it works. Every neighbor remembers those names. Every insulted farmer secretly repeats them under his breath, no matter how much he pretends to ignore them. Memory, sharpened by humor, cuts deeper than any ledger. Later that night, the farmer walks you to the door, the cold air biting at your cheeks. He points across the valley, where faint torchlight glimmers from another farm. "That's where Crooked Tooth came from," he says with a grin. Then, more softly, "Funny thing is, I can't remember the man's real name anymore. But I'll never forget the sheep's." You smile, realizing that in the long run, the flock's nicknames may outlive the neighbors themselves. And maybe that's the secret. Rivalries fade, families move, but the memory of a sheep called Mudpants or Crooked Tooth lingers, tucked into songs, stories, and laughter around a fire. Even insults become heirlooms when tied to a woolly face chewing grass in the snow. The next morning, frost clings to every surface, so thick it looks like the world has been dusted in ground glass. You trudge into the pasture with the farmer, expecting another round of silly names shouted by children. Instead, he crouches near a broad-horned ram and gestures for you to look closer. The horn is curved, ridged with age, and carved. You blink. Faint scratches run along the outer curve, not random gouges but deliberate strokes. Runes. The farmer traces them with his fingertip, muttering under his breath. You can't quite catch the words, but the ram stands still, as if accustomed to the ritual. The marks are simple, shallow, yet they gleam where the frost has melted in the grooves. This is no casual doodle, it's an identifier. The sheep doesn't just have a name spoken aloud, it carries one etched into its very body. Historically, runes weren't just letters, they were symbols of power. Norse carvers inscribed them on stones, weapons, and charms. Finding them on a sheep's horn may sound eccentric, but livestock was wealth, status, survival. Marking an animal with runes could have been as much about ownership as about protection. Like a medieval combination of branding and magical insurance. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some scholars have suggested that certain runic scratches found on bone or horn might have been practice inscriptions, carved by children or apprentices learning the alphabet. Imagine the farm kids, knife in hand, scratching their sheep's horn with the same earnestness we scribble names on school notebooks. Instead of Kevin was here, its Thorhoof belongs to Ingrid. Historians still argue whether such carvings were truly magical or just practical. Were they meant to ward off predators and illness, or were they simply tags to keep sheep sorted in communal grazing fields? Maybe both. After all, what better way to protect your wealth than to give it both a name and a spell? The farmer shows you another horn, this one belonging to Snowbutt, who looks thoroughly unimpressed with your curiosity. The runes here are simpler, almost childish. You suspect one of the kids carved them. The symbols don't spell out anything you recognize, maybe gibberish, maybe a secret code. Either way, the carving has become part of the sheep's identity. Snowbutt is no longer just a funny nickname shouted in the yard, she's marked in bone, immortalized until the horn itself wears down. It makes you wonder, how many horns carried hidden names long lost to time? Archaeologists sometimes find fragments of carved horn, tucked in graves or midden heaps. Maybe some belonged to animals like these, their names etched by hands long gone. You picture a future scholar holding a horn fragment labeled poop bottom and struggling to assign its sacred significance. You snicker quietly, nearly startling the ram. There's something intimate about this act of carving. Spoken names drift on the wind, forgotten if not repeated. Carved names endure. They stay even when the sheep is sold, when the farmer dies, when the flock scatters. Their memory turned physical. You run your finger over the grooves, cold and rough, and you realize you're touching a story pressed into horn centuries ago. The children race into the pasture, and one proudly announces he has carved his lamb's name already. The farmer pretends to scold him for using the knife without permission, but you catch the smile tugging at his lips. Even here, tradition and rebellion blur. The lamb bleats loudly, as if announcing its new identity to the frozen hills. As the family heads back, you linger for a moment, staring at the runes glittering faintly with frost. The horns curve like crescents, half-moons etched with secrets. Whether spell or scribble, you can't deny the effect. The sheep are no longer just remembered, they are inscribed into history itself. And as you trail behind the family, you whisper to yourself, memory written in bone lasts longer than memory spoken in song. But together, song, joke, carving, they make the sheep unforgettable. Night presses in heavy and velvet, and you find yourself lying beneath the wooden beams of the farmhouse, lulled by the faint bleating from the pasture. It should be ordinary background noise, but it feels different tonight, like a choir drifting between waking and sleep. Somewhere between the creak of the rafters and the hush of the hearth fire, the sheep begin to wander into your dreams. You see them, not as they are in daylight, but hazy, luminous, walking across meadows that shimmer like frost under moonlight. Their names hang above them like faint glows, Ember Ear, Rockhoof, Snowbutt, yes, even her, she looks quite regal in dream form. Each name echoes when spoken, not in a shepherd's voice but in your own, as though you've carried them into this dreamscape. Folklore once suggested that sheep carried more than wool and meat, they carried messages. There are scraps of Norse tale hinting at dream sheep that guided people through visions. One saga fragment describes a shepherd who fell asleep and saw his flock walking along a rainbow bridge. Each sheep bore a name, and each name whispered a warning about the season ahead. Historians still argue whether this was poetic metaphor or evidence of genuine belief in prophetic animals. Either way, the imagery sticks. You can't forget the sight of woolly prophets stomping across a celestial arc. The quirky tidbit here: in some remote parts of Scandinavia, people once believed that if you dreamed of a sheep speaking its name, you would either gain unexpected fortune or face a sudden storm. Pretty vague, as all dream omens are, but it gave sheep a strangely mystical presence. Not just livestock, they were walking riddles of fate. Back in your dream, one lamb trots up close. Its wool glimmers like starlight, and when it bleats, the sound comes out as words, your own name, repeated back to you. You nearly laugh, because who knew sheep could be such surreal conversationalists? Yet there's something grounding about it, as if the sheep are holding a mirror to your identity. For centuries, people whispered the names of sheep to remember them. Maybe in dreams the sheep whisper back so you don't forget yourself. You turn, and there's the farmer from earlier, dozing with his back against a fence post, while his sheep file past in a calm parade. The children are there too, sound asleep but giggling in their dreams, their voices carrying through the night air like echoes of bedtime stories. The sheep walk on, names glowing, into the misty dark. You get the sense that the dream itself is an extension of the naming ritual, a roll call not just of animals but of memory, family, and land. When you half wake, you catch yourself smiling. The farmhouse is still, save for the faint crackle of embers. Outside, the sheep are quiet. You realize you've joined a very old tradition, falling asleep to the rhythm of sheep names. And you chuckle softly at the thought, so this is the real origin of counting sheep. Not just numbers, but names, little stories whispered into the night, helping both shepherd and dreamer drift into slumber. Snowbutt, of course, appears one last time, wagging her tail in your dreams like some woolly trickster goddess. She bleats, and instead of prophecy or wisdom, all she says is, "Don't forget me." Which, honestly, is a pretty solid exit line for a sheep. By the time the next dawn arrives, you've lost all track of how many sheep names you've carried in your head. They tumble around like coins in a pouch: Ember Ear, Rockhoof, Cloudnose, even ridiculous Snowbutt, all shimmering with the weight of memory. You step into the morning pasture, expecting the naming ritual to end here, tucked neatly into its medieval corner. But it doesn't. It continues, reshaped, threaded into modern life. On the far edge of the field, a younger farmer, descendant of the same line you've been following, snaps a photo with his phone. You watch as he uploads it, captioning it with the sheep's nickname, Stormy. The screen glows in the early frost, a new kind of rune. And just like that, you realize, naming sheep has not ended. It has only migrated into new forms. Historically, Norse families used names to keep memory straight when flocks grazed in shared fields. Today, some farmers tag sheep with plastic markers, barcodes, even GPS trackers. Yet if you talk to them, and you do, you'll find many still whisper names. Not always out loud in the field, but in kitchens, barns, or farm forums online. Stormy, Flopsy, Beardface. The names stick because humans can't help themselves. We bond by naming. Here's the quirky twist: a few Scandinavian farms have social media accounts for their sheep. Yes, really. Followers keep track of animals by name, cheering for lambing season like it's a celebrity baby reveal. You scroll through the comments, and it feels oddly familiar. Different tools, same impulse. To remember through naming, to laugh through naming, to keep sheep stitched into family life not as anonymous units of wool but as individuals. Historians still argue whether this continuity should be taken seriously. Some call it sentimental nonsense, while others see it as cultural heritage disguised as casual practice. But when you stand in the frosty grass, watching Stormy chew on a fence post like it owes him money, you can't deny the truth: the tradition is alive. And you realize something else: you've been woven into the ritual, too. Every sheep you've imagined, every silly nickname you've giggled at, Every rune you've traced in your mind's eye, they're all in your memory now. Like the Norse shepherd reciting names under his breath centuries ago, you carry them. The flock is inside you. The children of today might not carve runes into horns, but they carve hashtags. Farmers might not sing names under the stars, but they hum to their sheep when no one's listening. And even you, city dweller, listener tucked under blankets with earbuds, have joined the old lineage. You've counted sheep not as faceless numbers, but as named companions in a midnight story. You smile at the thought, because suddenly, counting sheep doesn't feel boring at all. It feels intimate. It feels ancient. It feels like you've been entrusted with a secret much softer than stone monuments, but no less enduring, memory kept alive in wool and whisper. And maybe tonight, when you drift off again, you'll hear them, stormy, ember ear, snowbutt trotting into your dreams, demanding their roll call one more time. The fields grow quiet. The frost softens in the pale light, and the sheep settle into gentle grazing, as though the long night of naming and dreaming has finally lulled them too. You feel your breath slow to match theirs, steady and unhurried, a rhythm older than language. The names you've carried begin to blur together, no longer sharp or separate, but drifting like snowflakes into stillness. The silly ones fade into laughter's echo, the solemn ones dissolve into calm. One by one, the flock of words curls up in your mind like sheep in a barn, finding warmth in closeness. Even the carved runes, those sharp marks of memory, seem softer now, like grooves worn smooth by centuries of touch. They are no longer warnings or spells, just quiet reminders that every life once held a story worth keeping. You let the meadow around you dim into dusk, the woolly shapes dissolving into the folds of dream. The world narrows, the air thickens with silence, and you are safe, wrapped in the same comfort that once carried Norse families through endless winters. The sheep no longer demand roll call. They rest. And so do you. Sleep comes not as a command but as an invitation, slow, steady, irresistible. Let it take you, let it keep you, the way names once kept the flock together. The last sound is a faint bleat, barely there, playful and familiar. Snowbutt, of course. A trickster even at the edge of dream. You smile, and the smile carries you into rest. Good night.